If you picture a jazz musician in your head right now, you're probably seeing someone with a saxophone, a trumpet, behind a drum set or a piano, or maybe with a guitar. What you probably aren't thinking about is someone with a set of great Highland bagpipes. But that's exactly what Rufus Harley played. Rufus Harley was born in North Carolina in the early 30s, but moved to Philadelphia pretty soon after that. He grew up playing saxophone as a kid and ended up working for the city once he was an adult. That was about to change though. In 1963, towards the end of the year, the sitting president, John F. Kennedy, was assassinated. Rufus Harley watched the funeral, and along with millions of others, he watched the United States Air Force pipe band, providing an incredibly strong accompaniment to the funeral procession. After the funeral, he was fascinated by the instrument, so he picked up the phone and started ringing around Philadelphia pawnbrokers. That was the only place you might be able to find a set of bagpipes. He didn't. He actually had to go to New York City to find a pawnbroker that had a set on hand. He went to the pawn shop, paid $120 for a set of bagpipes, and gave it a go for about 24 hours. It sounded like garbage, and he decided to take it back. But just as he was leaving, he had a change of heart, turned around, grabbed the bagpipes, and went home. It ended up taking about 6 months for him to get a really good hold on the instrument when he felt that he could comfortably play it in a jazz style. Now, the ballad of Rufus Harley may have ended right there and then if it weren't for a changing of the guard in the jazz division of Atlantic Records. Now, Atlantic Records is now, and even then, was known really for its R&B and soul music. Their roster included Aretha Franklin, Otis Redding, and Wilson Pickett, among others. But Atlantic also had a really strong jazz catalog, especially in the late 1950s and early 1960s. Some of the albums they produced are still classics today, including John Coltrane's Giant Steps and My Favorite Things, as well as Ornette Coleman's The Shape of Jazz to Come and Free Jazz. Atlantic Jazz also had artists including Charles Mingus, Joe Zawinul, and Freddie Hubbard, all heavyweights both at the time and over the next 20 years or so. Atlantic was formed by Ahmet Ertegun, who was a Turkish immigrant to the United States, and his older brother, Nasuhi Ertegun, was the head of the jazz catalog. Now, he was turning his attention to other facets of the record label's business, and so Nasuhi gave the job to a friend of his, Joel Dawn, an ex-radio DJ. And Joel Dawn was interested in the left-of-field artists out there, and it was Joel who gave Rufus Harley and his bagpipes his first recording contract. You'd be totally justified in doubting Dawn's ability as an A&R man, but to Dawn and Harley's credit, the first album that he produced, Bagpipe Blues, did really well. The first album sold between 5,000 and 6,000 copies, and that may not sound like much today, but at the time, for a debut jazz act, that was a big deal. Rufus Harley went on to record 3 more albums with Atlantic, including Scotch and Soul, and his third album, A Tribute to Courage, which actually made number 32 on the jazz album charts. People were ready for a novelty act. They actually really enjoyed jazz being played on a set of bagpipes. Rufus did the rounds on television as well, including an appearance on I've Got a Secret.
Mr. X, you play an instrument?
Yes.
Is it how you play it that's unusual?
Yes.
No jazz musician plays a bassoon.
The public may have enjoyed Rufus, but critics told a different story. They weren't so much critical as they were confused. Critic Stanley Dance called Rufus Harley a good gimmick by the decade standards, but he said it was a mercy that on his first album, the bagpipes were only played on 3 of the 7 tracks, which probably says something about Atlantic's confidence that the bagpipes would be accepted as a legitimate jazz instrument. Elsewhere, the music was described as screeching, barbarous, and provocative, not in a good way. Melody Maker magazine said of Harley's music, he manages to play jazz on the bagpipes. It's not the best jazz you ever heard, but it's unmistakably jazz. The fact is, non-traditional instruments have always had a hard time, sometimes deserved and sometimes not. Buddy Emmons was a really excellent pedal steel guitar player. Now, I love Buddy Emmons, but his jazz albums, while good, don't really feel like jazz albums. Even his team up with Canadian guitarist Lenny Breau is mostly good for Lenny's work. One example of a non-traditional instrument that doesn't get the credit it deserves is the harp. Dorothy Ashby played the concert harp or the pedal harp in the 60s and 70s, and it sounds like a jazz instrument, but she had the triple problem of being a harpist, black, and female. And so I guess it was perhaps a hard sell at the time. But truly, it is criminal that she isn't given the recognition she deserves today. Now, in contrast to Dorothy Ashby and Buddy Emmons, there are non-traditional instruments that have found their way into the jazz vocabulary. The harmonica is a good example. Toots Thielemans was a Belgian-born jazz musician, originally a guitarist, but picked up the chromatic harmonica and did wonders with it. You might know Toots's music from one of the early Sesame Street themes or from the opening number to Breakfast at Tiffany's. He's playing harmonica on that version of Moon River. And then, of course, there's the jazz flute.
You play jazz flute?
Herbie Mann was originally a saxophonist, but played jazz flute extremely well. And now a lot of saxophonists do double on flute, but you could make the argument that without Herbie Mann, that may not be the case. So why didn't Rufus Harley do for the bagpipes what Herbie Mann did for the flute? I have a couple of theories that I think hold up. Jazz requires a certain flexibility with its vocabulary. It's a heavily chromatic language, not just in the melody, but also just in the harmonic movement of the tunes that you're likely to play. The bagpipes are sort of the opposite of that. Bagpipes have drone pipes most of the time, and Rufus Harley's were tuned to a B flat and an F, which means that under everything he played, a B flat and an F rang out in a low register. That essentially meant he could only play in B flat. And then his chanter pipe, which is what the melody is played on, only had 9 notes. And of those 9, 2 were doubled in a higher octave. So he's only got 7 of the 12 notes available in the Western chromatic scale, which makes it difficult to play jazz vocabulary. The closest that Harley ever came to quote-unquote legit jazz was when he played with Sonny Rollins in the early 1970s. Sonny Rollins, if you don't know, was one of the most important tenor saxophonists in the 50s, 60s and 70s. During the tour, Harley would play bagpipes on a few tunes, although mostly he was playing saxophone as well. A live album of those sessions called The Cutting Edge was recorded, but Rufus only plays on one song. The song is a rendition of Swing Low, Sweet Chariot, which you could argue the traditional nature of the song lends itself to the bagpipes and the diatonic sound. Harley takes the main melody, plays a solo, and then lays out as Sonny plays a solo and then the guitarist on the record does as well. That one track is probably the best example of how bagpipes can work in a jazz sense. That might be partly because the bagpipes aren't playing the whole time. It is completely because the bagpipes aren't playing the whole time. Unfortunately, while Rufus Harley made it onto the Sonny Rollins album, The Cutting Edge, he was left on the cutting room floor after the tour. Sonny Rollins was quoted saying, "Didn't feel like bagpipes made sense in a traditional jazz band." Harley kept playing and touring through until his death in 2006. In the last 10 years of his life, he made a couple of films and recorded a few more original studio albums. But even if Rufus Harley's back catalogue isn't particularly well renowned, did he trailblaze a way for jazz bagpipes to become a niche jazz instrument? Not really. The bagpipes do still sometimes make a cameo in music, but not really in jazz. The best example in the last 50 years might be AC/DC and Bon Scott's use of bagpipes in Long Way to the Top. But that's in a style of music that is harmonically pretty simple, in a band that played fairly simple versions of that music as well. And so the droning diatonic nature of the bagpipes sort of fit a little better. There are a couple of jazz players that play the bagpipes. David Watson is a Kiwi-born jazz musician, and he's originally a guitarist, but has played the bagpipes on a few albums. His album Skirl is very bagpipe focused and is worth checking out. It's not really jazz though, it's sort of a experimental avant-garde noise sort of album. There's also the Swedish performer Gunhild Carling. She plays bagpipes in a swing band, although it's more cabaret than jazz, and her use of the bagpipes really does sit more on the novelty side. Still, if you're extremely interested in bagpipes and jazz, all of those are worth checking out. Otherwise, just stick to that one Sonny Rollins album. If you've made it this far, thank you. Jazz and bagpipes is not the most obvious thing to spend 10 minutes watching a video about, so I appreciate it. Like and subscribe if you'd like, and I'll see you next time. Wasn't there a, who said the true mark of a gentleman is one who can play the bagpipes but chooses not to? I'll look it up.